And welcome everyone to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke, taking over for John Macri this week, who's taking some much needed PTO before we get the season started. So I get to take the host role this week. So taking my spot as the expert role, we have Ben Brown. Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Nathan. I hope you enjoyed your vacation. I got to take, maybe a little bit more of the expert role last week with John. But I definitely appreciate you guys having me on these last couple of weeks and, giving yourself some much needed rest because, like you said, football is right around the corner is all I can really say. And I'm pumped for it to be here and as close as it actually is already.
Yeah, definitely appreciate you being here so that we can take at least a little bit of a break since even in the past when we've had PTO, it's get a little bit of work done here, a little bit done there. So
Right.
glad that I could try to have a couple of days where I stayed away from the news, but there was a decent amount of news over these past couple of days. Today in general, we'll be talking about our top 10 training camp storylines to monitor now that rookies for almost every team have reported at this point. We already have veterans reporting for a few teams. The rest will be reporting later this week. And we have the Hall of Fame game a week from Thursday. So we are very close to having some form of NFL football, even though it's not going to be the most competitive NFL games out there. But before we get into the 10 training camp storylines, we do want to talk briefly about two of the free agent signings that we had over these past couple of days. We had Melvin Gordon signing with the Baltimore Ravens and Cole Beasley signing with the New York Giants. Ben, do you have thoughts on any of those two signings and any kind of impact that they could have?
I mean, I think the Cole Beasley slot receiver sign of the New York Giants has to be one of the biggest log jam positions. I know we were hearing, reports of Paris Campbell kind of being this guy that could, make some manufactured targets, could get some carries out of the backfield a couple months ago. And they still very much have Wan'Dale Robinson, who was a guy that I was, really high on from a fantasy perspective, but maybe seems to be running, with the twos. It's going to be interesting to see how that training camp battle breaks out. And then they have Jamison Crowder as well. So I'm not quite sure who's even going to make the roster at this point, from the New York Giants, wide receiver position right now, because it seems like they have, four potential options at the slot receiver position and a number of other guys, that at least played some meaningful snaps last year, like Isaiah Hodgins obviously is going to be with the team, Darius Slayton, but, Sterling Shepard, David Sills, guys like that, there is a ton of, uncertainty, I would say, as far as who's even going to be, the seven guys that they keep on the roster, I would say. So it's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. I also wasn't, I would say, really expecting Melvin Gordon to kind of be the first veteran running back to finally land with the team here as we kind of move towards training camp. I think just with the issues that we've seen from him in previous seasons, the fumbling and everything else, it very much seems like he's not going to get, a ton of meaningful reps over a guy like Gus Edwards. So I know they're kind of interesting past names, but I just don't think either one of these guys are going to have any sort of impact from a fantasy perspective at all this season. So I know it's news, it's noteworthy, but it definitely isn't, I would say, moving the needle for me in any one direction.
Yeah, for me with the Giants, my first thought is he has experience with that coaching staff. I don't know how much of it is him mentoring some of these other receivers, but I also had the thought of they're a little less optimistic about some of their injured wide receivers coming back with
Right.
Sterling Shepard, Wan'Dale Robinson, both dealing with the injuries that they've had. So I also started to think maybe be a little less optimistic on them, but in general, all these Giants receivers are late round sleepers, and now it might be slightly harder to draft them. And then with Baltimore, I think it's an interesting situation. I think probably the biggest player to be concerned about their roster role is Justice Hill now, who's been their third down back for forever. So maybe Gordon's taking some of those third down snaps, but ideally a healthy J.K. Dobbins would be taking third down snaps as well as significant snaps on early downs to maximize his fantasy potential. So this might just lower the ceiling just a little bit on Dobbins' potential this season.
Right. Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I do think the Justice Hill thing just never really took off in a lot of ways. So maybe Gordon's the third down back, but I think in some ways maybe it just speaks kind of like you said, J.K. Dobbins being be closer to a workhorse running back. Maybe we see Gus Edwards get some early down work, and J.K. Dobbins is more of the late down guy. But I still very much, I would say, am pretty bullish about where J.K. Dobbins could potentially land here as well. So
there. So before we get to our 10 training camp storylines to monitor, we'll get a word from our first sponsor. What's on your family's summer bucket list? Maybe some traveling or going swimming or cookouts in the backyard. Something that should be on every parent's bucket list is protecting their children through every season of life, no matter what. Fabric at Gerber Life makes it quick and easy to protect your family with a term life insurance policy, so you can focus on fun. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high quality, surprising, affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. Fabric has flexible policies that fit your family and your budget, with quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Get your personalized quote in just minutes and then apply when it's convenient for you. It's all online and on your schedule. You could go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, MEET fabric.com/fantasy. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. And with that, we'll get into our 10 training camp questions, and we will start with the running backs with the biggest thing on everyone's mind recently, the running back holdouts that we are seeing. Last week was the deadline for franchise tag players to get a long-term deal, and none of the running backs did that. Tony Pollard signed his franchise tender a while ago, so we aren't really worried about him missing time, but there have been talks of running backs being unhappy, a lot of them getting on a Zoom call together to discuss their options. We had Monday morning, Tom Pelissero report that Raiders running back Josh Jacobs, who hasn't signed his franchise tender, was spotted this morning boarding a flight leaving Las Vegas. And Jacobs won't report for training camp Tuesday and has told people close to him that he doesn't plan to return anytime soon. And similarly, there were reports before the franchise tag deadline that Saquon Barkley made it clear that he doesn't like the franchise tag and his availability week 1 would be in question if he doesn't get a long-term deal, which he did not get. So there's a chance that both of these players will probably be not with their team for a while now and could at least potentially miss some playing time. Ben, do you have any thoughts about all the stuff going on with running backs recently, as well as these two specific situations?
yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like we are kind of at a line in the sand type moment from the running back position. Obviously, from PFF's perspective for quite some time, we've, at least kind of led the course as far as like just how impactful or lack thereof a running back can be to a team's actual winning situation or win expectation. And I very much think that, the teams kind of being at the forefront of that has in a lot of ways proven, PFF's initial ideas and research sort of correct from that perspective. And this is, in a lot of ways the fallout. And I do think you're going to see, guys' feelings get hurt, situations where things just aren't going to resolve in a really helpful or beneficial matter for either side, because it does seem like the running backs in particular in the NFL level and the teams just are at such a serious disconnect for how much value that any one player could actually bring from that perspective. And I do think that's why we're very much seeing this sort of fallout. And I think it's only going to continue. But like guys like Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley in particular, like they don't have a ton of recourse outside of sitting out. And I do think from like a fantasy perspective, that's going to be a scenario that we're going to probably continue to see for, more and more years, like these top end, top 10 type running backs at their position from an ADP perspective and from a projection perspective, like very much have a ton of risk from a fantasy drafting perspective as we head towards training camp, because it very much sounds like, Josh Jacobs in particular is going to dig his heels in and very much won't be around during training camp. And if that happens, teams start to make plans and they start to develop plays and they start to see other guys get those meaningful reps. And then you start to wonder, like, is his volume, which very much, it carried him to the number 1 running back spot in fantasy last year, is really going to continue in that direction. So I think it's, there's a ton of concern. Obviously, if which one of these guys is going to hold up versus not, and pick correctly, like you are probably going to have a leg up on the rest of the people that you're drafting with. But right now, given what we're hearing, like the risk is too great for me, from Josh Jacobs' perspective in particular to really go about drafting him, at this current, ADP of 30 and those sorts of things in the back half of the, in the midpoint of the second round in a lot of 12-team leagues. So I'm not touching Josh Jacobs. I do think we see Barkley probably play meaningful reps for the New York Giants at some point, I think, but it's still a situation where the demise of the running back position both at the NFL level and fantasy it is very much seems to be playing out before our eyes, and I think that we all have to adjust sooner rather than later to kind of some of those changing dynamics. And I do think one of those things is very much people from a fantasy perspective focusing on the zero running back or maybe the hero running back type approach and going with more wide receivers and tight ends and maybe even quarterbacks at the top of the draft, and kind of looking for these secondary options that could play very prominent roles, especially in spots like Las Vegas with Zamir White. So I think those guys are the ones that I really want to be targeting right now, just based on the uncertainty, because I do think he's the guy that could land, top 15 at the position if Josh Jacobs does end up holding out the entire season, which does seem like at least some sort of possibility right now. So don't want to touch either of the top end guys, but very much I would say kind of intrigued by how the snap share and everything else plays out for guys behind him, especially if they are missing some time in training camp.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting situation with both of these running backs in that if you were to rank all of the teams just by their backup running backs, I would think both of these teams would be somewhere near the bottom. We just haven't really seen anything out of Zamir White so far outside of the preseason last year. And then Matt Breida being the top guy with the Giants. We've seen plenty other teams with better backups. So it'll be interesting to see how far into this situation if the teams are trusting the guys that they have as their backups, or there's the number of free agent running backs who are still available. The Ezekiel Elliott's, the Leonard Fournette's, Dalvin Cook still out there, Kareem Hunt, and there's plenty of guys that we're seeing getting looks from teams that are even lower than that, in terms of how people think of quality running backs. But like James Robinson is still out there getting looks. Darrell Henderson is still out there getting looks. Guys like Kenyon Drake, who didn't sign with the team until like early in the season and ended up seeing significant playing time last year. There's just a ton of running backs available that I might not worry too much about these running backs for the short term, and that, yeah, they might sit out week one to prove a point, but I don't see them sitting out the entire season. So you can probably live with drafting someone who's not going to play week one as long as they're still getting their normal role the rest of the season. But if these teams really start to adjust or start to like one of these backups, then we might see less playing time out of them this year. We saw with Josh Jacobs last year, he was running the ball at a very high rate that we typically don't see out of running back these days. So it could easily, even without the holdout, see his snaps going down. And Barkley did not grade well as a receiver last year. They drafted a receiving running back in the draft that could take some of those snaps. All of his receiving fantasy work was more in terms of volume and more so than playing at a high level. So we could see Barkley, even without the holdout, see his snaps go down on passing downs a little bit. So there's definitely concerns there. And I think the more that, like, it's not going to be surprising if they hold out for all of training camp, because why would they want to go to training camp? And there's not too much to gain or lose from them from doing that. But I think once we get closer and closer to week one and we don't see them come back yet, or once one of these teams adds a veteran, that's when you really start to get concerned.
Right. And that's when I think you really start to see the ADP shift. I think it will be interesting to see just kind of how this initial news is digested from like the best ball market in particular for a guy like Josh Jacobs. Like if he does move down, at all, they even drop maybe like another round at that point, because kind of like you said, like that could be a scenario where you are maybe playing from ahead in a little bit of a ways and understanding that even though he does sit out training camp, like he could very much still be in the fold for week one relatively quickly. But I think it's probably too concerning for me to try and play it like that. But there's definitely, a pretty decent upside play if you are willing to risk it a little bit. And especially, especially, in today's fantasy landscape where you can just do the drafting and not really have to worry about, the start sit decisions and everything else. Like I think those are spots where Bracing or embracing some of this uncertainty could really lead to quite a bit of upside in some of those bigger contests. And I think that's the spot where I'd really want to have some exposure to maybe a guy like Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs if it does seem like things at some point are going to have them back in the fold sooner rather than later.
That's fair. And with that, we will move on to our second story, and that's Javonte Williams and the questions around his health. He did Monday morning avoid the PUP list, which is a good sign that he should be able to play week one. The fact that he avoided that list and is going to be able to practice in some extent. The big question is when or if he will be 100% at any point this year. What are your thoughts on Williams for the 2023 season?
Yeah, I think we've kind of been waiting for, in some ways, this like workhorse type running back season from Devontae Williams. I do think if you buy into Sean Payton in a lot of ways, revolutionizing this offense or at least maximizing Russell Wilson's strengths within this particular offense, like I think you have to buy into a guy like Devontae Williams. And we are seeing, the injury news break positively and Melvin Gordon very much out of the fold right now, like Samaje Perine, Tony Jones Jr. Those are very much, I would say, more just like gonna get some late down passing work, long down a distance type situations, but aren't really gonna challenge him for high value touches, and especially some of those red zone touches. So I like it. I think it's intriguing. I know we have Devontae Williams basically is like what is he from an ADP perspective right now? I'm trying to find him.
Might even be early 30s or low 20s, somewhere around there.
Yeah, he's in the Alvin Kamara, Isaiah Pacheco range, Delvin Cook range. I mean, I think it looks like according to 4for4's underdog ADP, he's 89.1 with Delvin Cook at 93.6. So I think like from that perspective, I would love to take some upside with him given the positive news. This very clearly does feel like his backfield in a lot of ways. I might be downplaying the significance of Samaje Perine in this offense, but it very much seems like he could kind of be this, the Tavius Murray type player in the New Orleans Saints offense here in Denver. And given the fact that if they do see an uptick in efficiency, he's in line for he's definitely a guy that I think can drastically outperform his ADP and would very much be a target for me in the middle rounds where he's currently being drafted, I would say.
Yeah, and I think of a couple years ago with this Saints with more peak Mark Ingram and peak
Right.
Alvin Kamara, and both players were able to see significant touches and be relevant and for fantasy football purposes. So even if they are limiting Williams in terms of his snaps somewhat, just because they want to protect him from the injury or ease him into action and have Perine play a significant role, I think Williams can still produce from a fantasy perspective, even if he's not seeing as many snaps as some of us would hope that he sees, which he did see in that very last game before he got injured. The first half of the game, he, I think, played either 100% of snaps where only was taken out for a snap or two. So we finally saw it for a half of football at least. But
right. It's coming this year, Nathan. Just get ready for it. Basically, I do think there is kind of like you said, like there's a path to him being still really productive from an efficiency standpoint. But if the volume ever does carry through, which it seems like it easily could, he could very much finish a lot closer to where he was being drafted at last year and the year before than where he's currently being drafted at. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I'd say if you're drafting him, try to make sure you're getting at least some kind of safer running back that's somewhere in the RB2 to RB3 range, just because we don't know if Williams is going to be ready for week one or not, or how much they ease him in. So just having someone that you can put in your lineup to start the season, that'll at least get you some points, and you don't have to be too concerned about it, like one of the two Washington Commanders running backs, for example, where they don't have the most upside in the world, but they're going to at least score a decent amount of points that you can survive with them in your lineup, just probably not win your league with them in your starting lineup.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I do think, understanding the roster construction elements and the high leverage plays and kind of pairing those with some safe type plays is very much about how to optimize your overall fantasy performance for sure.
Moving on to our next topic, the Saints and Bears running back situation. I want to talk about these two together because to me, they are decently similar in that you have one incumbent running back with Alvin Kamara with the Saints, Khalil Herbert with the Bears. Both teams added veteran running backs this offseason. Jamal Williams with the Saints. The Bears added both Deonta Foreman and Travis Homer, and then both spent a decently high draft pick on a running back with Kendre Miller with the Saints, Rashawn Johnson with the Bears. So I think these are two of the more interesting running back battles to look at when you're looking at several running backs on the team. What do you make of these two situations?
Yeah, I think my first thing is basically that Deonta Foreman has had one of the weirdest career arcs from a running back perspective that I think we've seen in quite some time. I don't know if that's an actual take or anything, but it is interesting to me now. Like he's, the backup running back to Willie Herbert, who's a guy that I very much liked. Does seem like he's very much going to challenge for not only some early down work, but some of the goal line work and everything else. So I think it's concerning, right? Like I don't think there's a clear path to any one of these guys from the Bears perspective, really paying off their ADP, even especially if you do project Justin Fields to be, anywhere close to as run heavy as he was last year. I think the only way that any one of these guys potentially pays off their ADP is if they do see a pretty drastic leap from Justin Fields from a passing perspective, which very clearly eats into his rushing work and then very clearly allows for some shorter field and some shorter opportunities in the red zone for some of these guys to get in the end zone. But outside of that, I'm concerned. I don't think I'd want to touch any one of these the guys from the Bears perspective. I think for the Saints in particular, I think some of the concern obviously with Kamara was the potential suspension type situation. I think that has suppressed his ADP. It does seem like if something was going to happen, it would have happened right now, but still a spot I wouldn't really want to get involved. I know the Saints have one of the easiest, if not the easiest, schedules in football coming up, so they should be leading a lot of games. But I think that just means we're going to see a higher number of Jamal Williams type carries. Obviously the touchdown regression should be very much expected from Jamal Williams' perspective, but I still think it's a spot where he could pay off his ADP or, like you mentioned, the rookie Kendre Miller, guy that PFF graded really highly in college. I think at some point, not right away, he's going to challenge basically, I would say, for some of those, at least early down opportunities. I think he's very much going to be deserving of those. So maybe he's more of a waiver wire target or trade type target later on in the season, depending on how deep your league is. But he's very much a guy that I think I would be excited about drafting towards the end of, some of my fantasy leagues, because I do think, this is very much a spot towards the end of the season where he could be one injury away. And given the schedule that they have towards the end of the season, could very much be, a league winner type with the right volume towards the end of the season. So I think Kendre Miller is probably like my only real target. I would say from either one of these backfields that I would feel at all comfortable at, with drafting at their ADP right now.
Fair. And these are both situations where I think throughout the preseason, we should start to get at least a little bit of better picture, at least with the veterans. Right. Saints historically have played their starters at least some in the preseason. Last season, it gave us some confidence that Juwan Johnson was going to be the clear tight end on the team. Made it clear that Marquez Callaway was going to have a decent sized role early in the season. Similarly, the Bears, their last preseason game, 5 drives with their starters, which is a lot for a team these days. Made it clear St. Brown was going to be pretty high on the wide receiver depth chart, and gave a pretty clear indication of the split that we would see with David Montgomery and Herbert. So I think, especially with the veterans, we should start to see what the team is thinking in terms of what kind of rotation we could see. And some of this as well is teams will rest their starters at some point. So which of these running backs aren't playing in those preseason games versus which of the running backs are? And we see all the time rookie running backs playing late in a game or playing a lot in the preseason, and they don't work their way up in the depth chart until later, which is why a situation like Seattle, I'm not too much looking into now, just because I think we'll see Kenneth Walker be the starter through week 1. It'll just be how will things progress throughout the season. I just don't think we'll see too much indication right now. But with like the Bears situation, how much higher do they view Herbert compared to Foreman, or do they even consider Foreman higher? And Travis Homer, someone with Seattle, always been a third down back, and all 3 of the Bears' other running backs are more rushers more so than receivers. So do we see Travis Homer have a significant role? And then the Saints, Kamara's best backup these past couple of years has been a tight end in Taysom Hill. So They added significant competition for Kamara, so even without the suspension part of it, Kamara hasn't been playing as well these past couple
Right.
seasons. They invested a lot in some of these other running backs, so I could very well see Jamal Williams leading the team in carries, even if Kamara doesn't get suspended. I could see that kind of being the split between them. And I know Miller's a bit younger, so he might not play as much this year, or they might throw him into the fire. So I
Right.
at least think we'll see some with Williams and Kamara and how they're viewing that kind of split, and like see if they're rotating them by situation in the preseason when they are playing their starters, even though it might just be like one game for one or two drives in the preseason, but even that could be telling.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you 100%. I do think, the an early point you made in that, like monitoring who's playing with the starters and who's kind of sitting, with the starters and where that cutoff is at the running back position can be incredibly valuable information because we have seen, the some of these, rookie running backs and stuff get hyped up because of preseason performance where the starting quarterback and all these other players weren't playing and they still are very much, buried on the depth chart come regular season time. And I think it's just such a solid point to make that, it's telling what's happening on the football field from a preseason perspective, but it's also telling who's sitting out and who's kind of being grouped into that category, as well. Because I think that's very valuable information. I think very much, gonna be going to be information that I'll use to kind of place both of these backfields as we move closer to, week 3 of the NFL preseason, I would say.
Yeah, I still remember last year's preseason with Houston and Dameon Pierce, and he played so well in
Right.
that first preseason game, even though it wasn't with the starters. And then I'm working on my recap article as the game's going on, and it's like, why isn't Dameon Pierce getting time with the ones in this game? Why isn't he in?
Right.
And then once about halftime hit and he wasn't in with any of the players, then it's like, oh, they view him as a player that doesn't need to play in the preseason anymore. So him not
Right.
playing boosted him up significantly after that game.
Right. Right. Which is, I mean, it is like just kind of staying ahead of the market, right? And understanding some of these subtle things, but it, very much is something that, you've picked up on for years, but the rest of the fantasy community is just kind of starting to figure out, but very much still relies on you to kind of share a lot of that information in your recap, which is, some of the most valuable information that you can have from a fantasy perspective, in the preseason and even in the regular season as well.
Exactly. We'll move on to our next situation, and that is the Eagles running back situation, which we've talked about some on the podcast before, but I want to hear your perspective on this with Rashad Penny signing in free agency, DeAndre Swift getting traded for during the draft, and them still retaining Kenneth Gainwell and Boston Scott. What do you make of the Eagles running back situation this season?
Yeah, I want to pour up one out for Kenneth Gainwell. I think he was, it was still a situation where I remember when he got drafted with Philadelphia, he was very much like I loved him coming out of Memphis basically, and I was really intrigued to see where he was actually going to land. I thought, it probably wasn't a great landing spot at the time for him to go with Philadelphia. In some ways, it's still just like such a muddy backfield, but he's the guy that I would say is probably outperformed from a fantasy perspective than what a lot of people, expected. Obviously, some of that's injury related, but I still think he's going to be involved, right? And I think he still can very much kind of be a focal point in the passing game at certain points in times. Eagles are going to have, one of the most difficult schedules in football coming up here. So I do think they're going to have a lot more tighter games. And if they are kind of forced to pass, he could be a little bit more involved. So I don't mind kind of, going back to what we've talked about previously, how these things kind of progress during training camp and the preseason. But I think it's clear, it's probably tough to project who's going to get the lion's share of running back opportunities, especially on early downs. But it very much seems like Kenneth Gainwell is probably going to be the guy on a lot of high leverage third down plays. And I think that, buying into him at his ADP is probably the only spot I'd really want to touch. Maybe you can get, make a case for Rashad Penny if you do expect him to be, more involved in DeAndre Swift. But I don't have a strong take on this backfield, and I do think it's really crowded, especially with the Jalen Hurts factored in as well. And the fact that I'm just not sure the Eagles are going to be ahead and winning as many games as they were last year. So I do think it's going to be a more focal point on Jalen Hurts from a passing perspective. and to a lesser extent than Kenneth Gainwell getting more reps. So I think Gainwell's really the only spot I can see playing, at his current ADP. The rest, I think there's just too much unknown right now. I would say to really feel strongly about leaning in one of Rashad Penny's or DeAndre Swift's direction. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this because I know you've followed, at least in some ways, the reports and everything else, better than anyone else. And you can probably provide some insight as far as like how you see this snap percentage and rush attempt percentage kind of break out for all these guys.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting in that like Penny and Swift have both been injured a lot in their career as well. So I view this as a situation where even if we start to figure something out by week 1, I wouldn't be surprised if by week 3 it changes, and then by week 6 it changes again, and we see all those changes throughout. The big thing that I noted was going back to last preseason, the Eagles played their starters for the first drive of the first game, and then they were like, we're good, and didn't play them at all the rest of the preseason. But we did see some rotation of running backs, and like in season, they rotate players a lot more by drive, and a lot of teams in the preseason also will or rotate by situation. A lot of teams also rotate during situation in the preseason. The Eagles were rotating by drive a bit more. So we saw Boston Scott last year in the preseason playing ahead of Gainwell at times, which made it a little more clear that Gainwell wasn't necessarily the clear-cut number 2 running back on the team, since Scott was still playing significantly on early downs, with Gainwell playing a lot on those third down situations. So I don't think we'll get a lot in the preseason in terms of who they view as the third down back versus early down backs, but we might get some better idea of a pecking order on the depth chart. So we might be able to see, particularly with Gainwell, if he's playing early because he's been on the team for a while and the other guys are new, or if the other players have already surpassed him on the depth chart. Gainwell could still very well be the third down back, even if he is playing late into preseason games. But I think we'll get a sense of maybe if one of these players might be in danger of getting cut, or those kind of things based on how the preseason progresses, since they might decide to stick with 4 running backs this year, but they might end up cutting one of them.
Right.
And it could be really any one of them.
It could be anyone. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that's thing is like, we didn't really mention Boston Scott, but in a lot of ways, he's been a pretty key contributor here, and is kind of like the veteran and very much been there the longest. So I think it would be, it's going to be surprising if any one of them gets cut. But obviously we have him 4th on the depth chart right now. But it will be very interesting to see kind of how they actually play this from a salary cap and roster spot management spot for them. I would say heading into the year, that is I would say a very key point to evaluate in this process for sure.
Yeah, and they need at least Scott for those 2 games against the Giants, who he always seems to be playing well against them. But like they didn't really invest all that much in Penny or Swift. When we see, like we were just talking about Jamal Williams, that he got a multi-year deal for several millions of dollars, where Penny, this is a 1-year deal. I think it was just over $1 million. It's not a huge investment in him. And Swift, it was the changes in draft picks, but it's not a lot of money invested in any of these guys. So a lot of the times we can look at where the money went and see, okay, they thought highly of this player, they paid him a lot of money, that should be a good sign he sees a lot of playing time. None of these players have a ton of investment in them, so that also kind of leads into the anything can happen here.
Right. I definitely agree. There's just so much unknown in a lot of these backfields. It's what I do think that's why we've seen a pretty seismic fundamental shift in who's getting drafted at the top of these drafts, especially here in 2023.
There. And before we move on to our next story, which is with wide receivers, another word from our sponsors. Want to get in on fantasy action, but sick of managing your roster, sick of player injuries ending your season? With Best Ball on DraftKings, you can get the best of your team all season long. This year, Best Ball on DraftKings is better than ever, with $10 million in guaranteed cash prizes up for grabs. For a limited time, you can join DraftKings' largest best ball contest ever and get your first entry back in DraftKings dollars as soon as your draft is finished. Act now before this offer expires. To start playing best ball, download the DraftKings app using code PFF and enter DraftKings Best Ball Millionaire Contest and snake draft your team for the season. Each week, you'll automatically rack up points from all your top scorers. No ads, drops, trades, or I should have played him instead. Teams with the most points by the end of the season will have a shot to take home the $1 million top prize. So what are you waiting for? Head over to DraftKings app and sign up with code PFF and start playing best ball today. Join the DraftKings $10 million best ball tournament, and you'll get your first entry back in DraftKings dollars. Only on DraftKings with code PFF. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER, one per customer. Opt-in required with $10 entry fee. Bonus issued as 10 DraftKings dollars. Age and eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See DraftKings.com/promotions for details. Ends August 9th, 2023. Next, we will move on to the Ravens wide receiver competition. Recently, we had Rashad Bateman didn't show up at the start of camp, was placed on the did not report list, but then reported the very next day. We saw the team draft Zay Flowers, seeing and getting a lot of buzz recently. They signed Odell Beckham, Nelson Aguilar. Also still have Devin Duvernay, who's been their slot receiver for some time. What do you make of this Ravens wide receiver competition?
I mean, you can't forget about Laquan Treadwell and Andy Isabella as well, I would say. But I don't know. This was a spot where I was pretty bullish on Zay Flowers kind of heading into the off season, basically out of mini camps and everything else. It did seem like the Rashad Bateman injury just had too much unresolved things still hanging out there to the point where he was actually going to be ready for training camp. It does seem like that was probably the correct take at the time. And then Odell Beckham Jr. as well, returning from the ACL injury. It did seem like it was a spot that Zay Flowers could potentially win the number one job right away, or could at least be, a focal point in training camp. And we could hear some of these reports that would obviously shift his ADP, and whether that, comes to fruition or he actually lives up to that ADP is now kind of the question, right? Because we have seen that fundamental shift, I would say, to the point where he's impressing, the rest of the guys really aren't in the fold right now. So it probably should be expected that he is running as the number one guy, but I very much think this is a spot that he could potentially hold on to and not really relinquish. So I'm bullish on it still. I know more people are definitely getting on board with that, but I do think when the season's played out, it's probably going to be Zay Flowers leading this team from a receiving yardage standpoint at the wide receiver position. I just don't know if Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be able to have enough left in the tank post torn ACL injury, post season off, and everything else, especially in this offense. So I think with the fact that they have Todd Monken in, bringing in a new offense that is going to have Lamar Jackson throwing the football more, like any missed reps and missed opportunities in training camp is going to be only magnified in that particular spot. So I like the fact that Zay Flowers is the one involved. And I very much think, he's the real one guy that I would want to be, I would say buying into still at this point in time, because it does seem like it's going to be him and Mark Andrews, and then everyone else is maybe just going to be a kind of a guy in this passing offense, I would say. So I'm still bullish on Zay Flowers. That hasn't changed. And I'm just loving that. I would say the initial training camp reports, I would say, that are only, further solidifying some of those initial ideas, I would say.
Sure. And I'm curious with the new offense that they have, how much this really changes things. And I know in preseason, teams kind of go vanilla in what they do with their personnel groupings and the plays that they call. But generally, when you look at the personnel groupings that they use in the preseason, it's more or less correlates to what they do in the regular season. You don't see teams near the top of the list in terms of 11 personnel usage in the preseason drop to the bottom in the regular season, or vice versa. And we've seen the Ravens last year in the preseason, they ran 11 personnel 50% of the time. That dropped all the way down to 12% in the regular season, but they were still near the bottom of the league in terms of 11 personnel both times. So I'll be curious to see how much more 11 personnel they are using in the preseason, how big of a jump that goes up compared to past seasons, and also who's playing in the slot versus who's playing out wide, since some of these guys have been more outside receivers. Devin Duvernay's typically been a slot receiver. So if we see Duvernay, even though we don't think of him as high on the depth chart, if he starts seeing snaps in the slot, or Nelson Aguilar as well, someone who is seeing snaps in the slot with New England last year at times. So who's playing in the slot versus who's playing out wide, and if that impacts some of the wide receivers and who we think's at the top of the depth chart versus who's actually seeing playing time.
Right. I do think your point is really valid, right? Like who's playing in the slot, especially in this offense that has very much been the focal point of the passing game outside of Mark Andrews. So whether it is Zay Flowers, maybe it's Odell Beckham Jr., like those are going to be spots that you really want to monitor, and you do probably buy into, the slot percentage of routes run a lot more than you would in maybe some other teams type situations. Cause that very much, I would say, especially for the Ravens offense, like you mentioned, it has been the spot that can actually kind of carry some value from a wide receiver passing or receiving standpoint. So I like that take quite a bit. I do think, going back to it with the injuries and everything else, like that does seem like Zay Flowers probably will have the higher, slot route percentage, but that's a situation that we're very much going to have to monitor, kind of like you said in the preseason, and move some things around because of that. But if he is, running a high number of snaps in the slot, I think that just further speaks to the fact that he probably is going to be the number one focal point. And the sooner if that happens sooner rather than later, it's only going to be more impactful to his long-term fantasy performance, I would say.
Exactly. Moving on, the Chiefs wide receiver competition. The Chiefs have a number of wide receivers, and a bit of recent news here as well. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, the one returning starter from last year. We have Kadarius Toney, who they traded for in the middle of last season. Over the weekend, suffered a knee injury. It was reported as a tweak, but he was still not back for Monday. And Travis Kelce, when he was talking about it, was saying that he hopes he's ready for the beginning of the season. So the fact that he's talking about beginning of the season, not hoping he's back later this week or something, isn't the best sign, especially with Tony's injury history. We have Sky Moore, who was a bit underwhelming as a rookie, but expected to step up this season. Justin Watson, who played a surprisingly high amount of snaps last year and is back this year. Rashee Rice, who they drafted in the second round. Richie James, who they signed from the Giants, who was their primary slot receiver last year in free agency. And per Pete Sweeney on Sunday, Justin Ross was getting looks with the first team offense, which we know at least Toney wasn't playing. We know there's probably some other wide receivers who weren't as well, and this could just be a lot of wide receivers rotating in and out. But Justin Ross is at least in the conversation, and Kansas City, at least the past couple years, has been rotating 5 or 6 different players. So what are you looking at with this several Kansas City wide receivers who could see playing time this year?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, outside of Kadarius Toney, like you said, I don't know where the injury situation is going to kind of fall from that, but very much taking a pause on really being, anywhere close to bullish on Kadarius Toney because of that. Like you said, the historical injury considerations, all things considered, like it just is a spot where it seems to be the same story again and again. So don't really want to, I would say buy into him too much, but a guy that I do love, I loved Rashee Rice coming out of SMU. Didn't run the fastest 40 time or anything like that, but in a lot of ways kind of fits, the 6'1", 200 pounds, maybe not the best separator. And maybe he did it on like a high volume of targets and, an SMU passing offense that threw the football a ton of times. But I still very much think he is in some ways this like weird, I don't know, I don't want to call it like NFL ready profile because of just like a volume perspective in college, but he made a lot of really difficult catches, made a lot of really intriguing type catches, I would say, at the college football level, graded really well from PFF's perspective, 85.6 receiving grade last season, and did it with a pretty decent average depth of target. So he's a guy that I think can win, in the intermediate types of fields, can win kind of over the middle, can kind of do a lot of things pretty well, maybe not any one thing really well, which is why he wasn't a first round draft selection, but he kind of carries an interesting pedigree for me, a little bit on the older side, but I would say very much produced at the college football level. And I think seeing him kind of come in and producing right away isn't all that tall of a task from my opinion. So I like him to potentially emerge. Maybe it's, coming in for Sky Moore or, Sky Moore moves down to the slot area and Rashee Rice comes in at left, right receiver or something. But it very much seems like he could potentially develop into more than just a guy in this passing offense. And if you're that with the ball coming to you from Patrick Mahomes, like you're going to be putting up pretty big, I would say, fantasy performance, especially based on where he's drafted at. So the one guy I really want to buy into, I would say, is Rashee Rice. And I think that he could easily, potentially outperform his expectation, right now based on his current ADP. Because the rest of the guys, I just don't really see, an upside case for anybody else, I would say right now.
That's fair. And like we know with Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Justin Watson, they're high average depth of target guys who aren't going to see a ton of targets and more just stretch the defense out so all these other guys can produce. But the Chiefs are an interesting team in that they do play their starters a lot in the preseason, considering they've had the same coach and quarterback for years now. They've still been playing guys a lot. So I think we will get at least some information about where they view these players throughout the preseason and how much snaps they're getting with the starters. Typically, when a rookie isn't playing very much with the starters in the preseason, I'm not looking into it too much. But last season, Sky Moore was pretty well buried down the depth chart, which
Right.
was a red flag for him then. And it showed throughout the season that he wasn't able to work his way up the depth chart very far. He was able to surpass two of the people that were ahead of him in the preseason. But I think it'll be very interesting to see where they have these guys in the preseason, since that should
Right.
be a pretty good indication of how they're getting used at the beginning of the season. And there are plenty of wide receiver situations that are a mess as well that we aren't talking about, but this one matters a lot more because if Patrick Mahomes develops chemistry
Right.
with a wide receiver, then that's a pretty big deal for fantasy, where other teams, even if a guy emerges as the number one wide receiver, it might not be all that helpful for fantasy purposes.
Right. The volume in which that guy is going to experience is like unmatched, right? And I think it makes it even more intriguing because they really don't have the number one wide receiver whatsoever, right? Like I think we were, even 2 years ago, like we were really intrigued with, who was going to be running third to Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. And now we're very much intrigued by who's going to be running second to Travis Kelce. But like they've only seen an uptick in passing volume, and Patrick Mahomes has only gotten better from 2 years ago. So if you can hit on that number two option here, and like you said, it is a complete logjam, and in a lot of ways it feels like a guessing game. But if you hit on that guy, like you have league winning upside, I would say, based on a pretty low ADP for a lot of these spots. So I'm with you. I think you got to take some chances. Maybe it's not just for Rashee Rice, but I do think, buying into a few of these guys and sprinkling it around some of your exposure is very much, I would say, a pretty solid upside case to potentially win your league.
There. So before we move on to the quarterbacks, I will get to our last sponsor of the day. If you haven't heard already, it's Smooth Sack Summer. When you're playing in the summer sun, make sure you're escaped from pubes to bum. That's right, this is the summer to keep your balls cool with still looking hot with Manscaped. The leaders in below the waist grooming are making sure we all have a ball this summer by giving our pants partners everything they need to stay fresh. Dive headfirst into Smooth Sack Summer by going to manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping with our code PFF. The Manscaped Performance Package 4.0 has everything you need to prepare that summer bod. They have built the ultimate grooming bundle for your summer grooming. The Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer features a cutting-edge ceramic blade to reduce grooming accidents thanks to their advanced skin-safe technology. The Lawnmower 4.0 has a 7,000 RPM motor, a new multifunction on-off switch can engage a travel lock, and gives you the ability to turn that 4000K LED spotlight on and off when needed for a more precise shave. Did I mention this trimmer is waterproof too? Beach, lake, or shower, this razor will devour even the strongest pubes. Manscaped even threw in two gifts to their Performance Package 4.0, the Manscaped Boxers and the Shed Travel Bag. Wearing sandals with some nasty toenails during the summer months? Take a look at the Shears 2.0, a luxury nail grooming kit. This kit includes stainless steel nail cutters, tweezers, and grooming scissors. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code PFF at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping with the code PFF at manscaped.com. It's Smooth Sack Summer, boys. Get on board or get left behind. Well, next we will move on to the Colts. Thank you.
I see what you did there, Nathan, because I know you went from a Manscaped ad and now we get to talk about Gardner Minshew. And I don't think there's a more fitting marriage than anything else we could do here. So
yes, deciding what order we're talking about things is definitely an art form. So we will get to
right.
the Colts quarterback battle, where we have Gardner Minshew, who was added in free agency, and Anthony Richardson, who was added in the draft, was my top sleeper quarterback when I wrote about sleeper quarterbacks last week, and basically is everyone's favorite sleeper quarterback at this point. But we don't know if Richardson is going to be starting at the start of the season, if they will go with Minshew, who has experience with the Colts coaching staff at this point. So depending on how they view things, how ready Richardson is, will depend on how this situation goes. How concerned are you about drafting Richardson this season, given the fact that he might not start at the beginning of the season?
I mean, I'm not concerned. I would say I do think this is a situation where, because like because like the starting quarterback and the backup quarterback are going to be so different from a scheme perspective, I do think we're going to get some signal, I would say, relatively early on, just as far as like what direction they're going to go. And I think that's only magnified because they do have a new offensive coordinator. Like this is a spot where it seems like it would be a lot easier to handle if you had some continuity at the offensive coordinator position and maybe some continuity at the quarterback position as well. To then bring in a guy that is, in a lot of ways different than what you have in the building. But the fact that all these guys are new, the offensive coordinators new, like they're gonna be wanting to install really one, I would say, real offensive base type package. And I think they have to kind of identify who they're gonna go with earlier rather than later because of that. So I think it's going to be a little bit more obvious than what people are projecting right now, just as far as like who's going to be starting early on. And I do think it's going to be Anthony Richardson. I don't think I don't think you draft him basically as high as they did without getting some meaningful reps for him right away in his rookie season. It does obviously, very much going to impact the skill position players, guys like Michael Pittman Jr. and even Alec Pierce, like may not have as much upside or even volume really if they do have Anthony Richardson in the fold as opposed to Gardner Minshew. So I think from my perspective, I'm buying into Anthony Richardson. And I really want to try and capture some of his upside and some of my exposure. But I think, with that understanding, like I'm much less bullish on guys like Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce because of that. But I think, Jonathan Taylor is probably like the one guy not going to be really impacted one way or the other. I mean, there is probably a case for Richardson cutting into his rushing volume a little bit, but I think in a lot of ways, some of the research PFF has done, like we've seen, the mobile quarterbacks can definitely open up things from a rushing perspective for running backs as well. So I think there's probably a pretty unique upside case for Jonathan Taylor. Once again, if you do expect some positive regression from, some of the interior guys along the offensive line here, Quentin Nelson, et cetera, like this is a team that should be able to run the football pretty productively. And I think if you have Anthony Richardson starting right away, like that's only going to be more extreme. And I think they're going to, be in a spot where they can win, quite a few ugly games given their relatively easy schedule. So I think it's Richardson right away. I think you can draft him confidently. I do think Gardner Minshew definitely is going to bring along some of that veteran presence, but very much I would say the expectation has to be that he's backing him up. I would say right away. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on this because I know I'm probably more bullish Anthony Richardson than most, even though it seems like kind of like you said, everyone right now, wants to see this happen as soon as possible, I would say.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to drop him down my rankings, even if Minshew is starting week one, just because if you're drafting Richardson, you're probably not drafting him to be your clear-cut starter because he's a risky quarterback, just because we don't know exactly how well he will do even when he is playing. So you're drafting a veteran to go along with him that's safer, that you can be comfortable with starting. A guy like Geno Smith or Derek Carr, guys who definitely are not being drafted to be fantasy starters, but you can definitely put in your fantasy starting lineup in a number of weeks and still see decent production out of him. So I think because you were already drafting Richardson and pairing him up with another quarterback, that even if he's not starting week one, you might not have been putting Richardson in your starting lineup week one, just because you wanted to see how he does before trusting him in your lineup when you have a capable other option. So I'm not too concerned that way. One thing I did want to comment on with what you were saying with Jonathan Taylor in particular, one thing I am a little bit concerned about is those goal line touches, since Taylor has had a ton of those throughout his career, way more than basically any other running back. And just with how much we saw Jalen Hurts running those quarterback sneaks last year, Hurts was one of the leaders in touches at the 1 yard line last season. So I could see this being a similar case where they run those quarterback sneaks where they're pushing the quarterback from the back to get him the 1 yard that they need, more so than handing the ball off to the running back compared to what we've seen in the past. So like you said, we could see Taylor getting more efficient in some of his runs because of the ways that Richardson can help the offense, but I am concerned about that touchdown production.
Right. That is, and I think that is a crucial point that I failed to mention and probably overlooked in a lot of ways. But there is quite a bit of touchdown risk, and like you said, like Jonathan Taylor is kind of like the a big, where he's definitely produced previously. Like that has to be a very big concern. So I definitely probably understated that or did not recommend that well enough, I would say. But yeah, I think you wrapped it up really well. Like the efficiency definitely improve for Jonathan Taylor, but there is like a volume perspective. And if it is those crucial, touchdown type value plays, like that could easily, easily impact Jonathan Taylor's final finish, I would say, from a running back perspective. So I appreciate you mentioning that because it is a very good point that, our readers should definitely take into account for sure.
Sure. So, next topic was quarterback health in general. Just wanted to touch on a few situations and let you comment on any of them that you feel the need to comment on. We had Jimmy Garoppolo. He should have no restrictions in training camp. I know there's been concerns with his injury. He was able to pass his physical, won't be on the PUP list. So everything seems positive for him and not really much to worry about there. Brock Purdy's probably the next one that people have been concerned about. I haven't heard any recent news on him, but just generally everything these past couple weeks have been trending in a positive direction for him. So things at least seem optimistic there. And then Kyler Murray is the other big one who he said that he is hopeful that he can play week one, which seems a little optimistic. I know I've seen a lot of analysis on looking at his ACL and how long it's typically taken players to get back from ACLs, but his injury was a little more complicated than that. Looking at some of Dr. David Chow's analysis, the meniscus injury that he also had that needed to be repaired will complicate things a little further. He's looking more at a week 4 to 8 range as being realistic for when Murray might return. And for that, like everyone has to sign off on it as well. Of the team has to be ready for him to return. It's a brand new coaching staff, and he hasn't played in this offense before, so that further complicates matters. But just wondering what your thoughts on any of these quarterbacks are, or if you're willing to take a chance on any of these injured quarterbacks.
I wouldn't. I think more even just from like a team perspective, I want nothing to do with any of these teams either in a lot of ways. I know it might be controversial. It's not really controversial to say about the Arizona Cardinals and Las Vegas Raiders, but even the 49ers, I think, given, the Brock Purdy injury considerations and what they gave up for Trey Lance and what they're going to actually do at the quarterback position, especially to start, like these are three teams that I think are going to be either as bad as what the betting market's projecting or definitely worse than what the betting market's projecting. I think from that perspective, the fact that they are just, very middling type quarterbacks, especially, Brock Purdy, Jimmy Garoppolo from a fantasy perspective, don't really offer anything from a rushing standpoint like Kyler Murray would. They're all just like, there's too much negatives, I would say, to really want to like buy into any one of these guys. I don't anticipate anyone being like anything close to a league winner. So they're more just going to be, maybe your 2B type running back and kind of like, or 2B type quarterback and kind of like what you mentioned, like there's much better options than guys like Geno Smith, et cetera. So I'm definitely passing on all these guys. I'll let someone else, potentially deal with some of these health concerns because I do think there's just no spot where I would think that they are going to be they're dropping low enough to the point where I would really want to roster them on my team. So they're all a hard pass for me, I would say at this point.
They're like Purdy's the one guy that I can get a little bit optimistic for. And this is probably more so for super flex leagues than anything, just because of how many quarterbacks need to be drafted in redraft leagues. But I do think Purdy did look good last season, and it has felt like for some time that a 49ers quarterback should be capable of putting up big fantasy numbers, being able to throw to Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle and having the offensive line that they do, and now having McCaffrey to throw to as well. That feels like it should be an offense that should be able to put up enough volume for a fantasy quarterback, and just the lack of big plays is probably what's held Jimmy Garoppolo back from being a key quarterback for the 49ers. But Purdy was making more big plays in the limited sample that we've seen of him. But still, if he is able to get healthy and able to make more big plays out of the 49ers offense than what we've seen in the past, thanks to the talent that he has around him, I think there's at least a chance that he can accumulate enough volume to be fantasy relevant in some leagues. But I think that's more of a risk than some of the other quarterbacks that I have ranked ahead of him, that in a redraft league, it's just worth keeping an eye on him, but leave him on the waiver wire. But I do think in super flex leagues, it's at least worth considering.
Right. Yeah. The Superflex League is interesting. I think to me, I'd still want to gravitate towards some more upside type options, but I do think maybe Kyler Murray could be that option, in a Superflex League. But yeah, redraft, nothing worth there. But there might be just a little bit of opportunity in some of these Superflex leagues. But I don't know. I need to see a little bit more in the training camp and everything else for where Brock Purdy's really how well he's, I would say, like playing right away, or if he's not playing, like getting that information is very much going to kind of swing the direction of that. Because if he's injured to start the season, like he just doesn't, to me personally, doesn't have a ton of upside to kind of make up some of that ground. So I'd very much ding him more from an injury standpoint than I would even other guys, I would say. So
That's fair. The last two stories we have today are on tight ends. We'll start with the Bills tight end situation, and I will start talking about Nyheim Hines, who is definitely not a tight end, but it will fit together by the end of this, I promise. Hines reported early Monday is expected to miss the season with a significant knee injury. Tom Pelissero noted that he was sitting stationary on a jet ski, was struck by another rider. Injuries are not expected to be life-threatening, but he will require season-ending surgery. Hines last year was used in a pretty interesting way over the stretch near the end of the season. From week 11 on, he had 36 snaps in the slot, 10 out wide, and just 26 in the backfield. So in a lot of ways, he was being used more as a slot receiver, often with James Cook as the running back in the backfield while Hines was playing in the slot. And the slot position has been an important one for the Bills offense for a number of years. And they didn't really seem happy with the players they had in the slot last year. Had Isaiah McKenzie and Cole Beasley both on the roster last year playing significant snaps in the slot. Neither of them are on the roster anymore. They added Trent Sherfield and Deontay Hardy, who are wide receivers, but neither of them are a clear slot receiver. But Dalton Kincaid is the tight end that they drafted, and he could be seeing significant time in the slot. There's been talk of the Bills potentially using more 12 personnel, but even when they're using 11 personnel, the big battle will be how much playing time does Dalton Kincaid get versus Dawson Knox. What are your thoughts on Kincaid heading into this season?
yeah, I think it is really interesting. And obviously, the thoughts are out to Nyheim Hines for the injury situation. He was, kind of a guy that they traded for to at least help alleviate the secondary receiving option in this offense outside of Stephon Diggs that they very much, I would say, haven't really filled yet. And I think going out and getting Dalton Kincaid as well is trying to kind of fill that gap. So I do love the fit. I don't think it takes all that long for him to overtake a guy like Dawson Knox, like you said, in 11 personnel. And very much could be the guy that is split out wide more than Dawson Knox. I think to me, kind of like what you mentioned with Nyheim Hines and playing all over the field, like I still kind of view James Cook as a potential player in that type of role. I know we haven't seen him really unlocked from a receiving standpoint for Buffalo yet in a lot of ways, but he was very much, I would say, kind of utilized like that at Georgia. And with the fact that they did kind of go this more like, big type running back behind him and Damian Harris and Latavius Murray, it does seem like one of those two guys could potentially also be, in the backfield with James Cook, potentially split out wide or split out in the slot and those sorts of things, and maybe get him a little bit more involved in the rushing game. So I think overall, probably more bullish on James Cook. I also do think Dalton Kincaid, kind of like I mentioned a little bit ago, will overtake Dawson Knox sooner rather than later. And I very much think it's actually going to be one of those two guys that are really kind of the underneath, low ADOT type targets that are going to be pretty beneficial in this offense and going to actually provide, I would say, a quite a bit of fantasy goodness. So I like Kincaid, I like James Cook, and I think given where this high volume passing attack is going to land, I think they can definitely both produce from a fantasy perspective. So I think that's very much how I would be playing this Buffalo Bills offense overall.
There. I agree with you. I think this definitely helps raise the floor, at least for Cook, just since I think Cook was definitely the receiving option. Hines was probably the second receiving option, just since the other running backs they added are very much runners and not as much receivers. So I think this probably gets Cook a little bit more playing time in the backfield. But I think with Kincaid, I could very well see him being the primary slot receiver. And if that does happen,
Right.
that's huge for fantasy. Where he's being drafted, you're probably drafting more than one tight end, so you can take someone who probably has a more solid role, and like there's definitely a chance that Kincaid is eased into action and isn't playing very much early in the season and playing more later in the season. But the big reason why we're watching this now is they're just to see in the preseason or in training camp how much they're using Kincaid right away. We've
Right.
seen plenty of times where rookie receivers in particular, don't play much early on and play more as the season progresses. And I know we tend to shy away from fantasy or rookie tight ends in fantasy just because they have a tendency of not producing right away and taking a year or two. But if you view Kincaid more as a receiver, which I think he will be used more in this Bills offense, I could see him producing a lot year one. So definitely a guy that I'm willing to take a chance on.
Right. Yeah, I think that the narrative shift of that you mentioned is so crucial, right? Like we haven't really seen the rookie tight end live up to fantasy expectations in any sort of setting recently. But if Kincaid is running out wide as opposed to being in line a little bit more, like I think that's a spot where he's, gonna smash some expectations and really could be that first guy that kind of breaks through. So I'm with you on it. I think somebody like if you expect the Buffalo Bills, I would say to win the AFC East, and they very much need somebody to emerge as that secondary wide receiver option. And I don't think there's any clearer option, I would say, than Dalton Kincaid. So if you buy into the Bills, I think you're very much buying into Dalton Kincaid at this point. I think you should draft, pretty much, I would say, accordingly because of that.
Our last topic of the day, the tight ends tight end situation with Chickasee Okonkwo. It feels like every podcast that we've had, we talked about him right away, and then every podcast it's been like, yeah, we've talked about him already, but he's definitely worth mentioning here. Before I set him up too much, I just want to hear what you have to think about Chickasee this year with the tight end situation in the league and how well he played last year.
I mean, I think it was very intriguing. Obviously, like the projections out are, in some ways going to be skewed now with DeAndre Hopkins in the fold a little bit. Like I think I was probably more bullish on him, 2 weeks ago than where I am at now, just because it does still seem like it's going to be a low volume pass and attack. They are going to get DeAndre Hopkins involved right away. Traylon Burks as well is probably going to get his. So I do think he can probably get close to where he was at last year. But I think if you look at where the Tennessee Titans were at last year and very much, expect them to at least be competitive in a lot of games in the way in which they kind of try to reduce variance and shorten games and win with Derrick Henry and have a high, play action volume. Like Okungwu is going to have some manufactured targets, but I'm just not sure the volume is really going to be there for him to finish as, like a top 4, top 5 type tight end. So I think I'd rather go elsewhere because I just don't know if there's a really strong upside case for him to finish close to the top at the position, in my opinion.
Yeah, for me, a lot of it is, especially this preseason, trying to figure out how much playing time he'll receive. Since
Right.
probably one of the most reliable things that I've seen while doing these preseason recaps that I've done, and there's been hits and misses, but the big thing that I've been pretty reliable on is finding sleeper tight ends to avoid based on how they've been used in the preseason. After week 1 of last preseason, mentioned Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant, and Alberto as all guys who had concerning usage in the preseason, and that played out throughout the regular season as well. The tight ends in the past have been interesting in how they've used tight ends in the preseason. 2 years ago, Anthony Firkser was a sleeper tight end, but even in the preseason, he was largely just playing in 11 personnel, not too much in 12 or 21 personnel, which when you have a younger guy who's going to play a lot of playing time in the season, you probably want to put him in all of the situations and not just have him be a situational player in the preseason. So I was low on Firkser heading into the 21 season, and that played out. Tight ends last year with Tennessee, they added Austin Hooper, only played in 1 preseason game, played for 3 drives, saw 100% of snaps in 11 and 12 personnel on those 3 drives, with Jeff Swaim playing in 21 personnel and 12. So it's a situation where last year Tennessee, you could tell which players they really trusted based on how little they were playing in the preseason, with Hooper just playing those 3 drives, with the Derrick Henry didn't play at all in the preseason, I believe. Their wide receivers, you could really tell, like some of them only played a drive or 2, with Robert Woods, I think, only playing 6 snaps, and then the playing time increasing from there. So I'll be interested to see if he gets to sit out a lot of the preseason, like a lot of the veterans have tended to do in Tennessee. And if he's playing in every situation, where last year it was mostly 12 personnel with a little bit of 11 personnel without Austin Hooper. The way that he can make this bigger jump is if he's playing all the time in 11 personnel and 12 personnel. So when he is playing for the 1 or 2 drives that he's hopefully he's playing all of those snaps for those drives rather than just playing situationally like we've seen in the past with him and with other Titans tight ends in the preseason. So If he's playing a lot in the preseason, I would find that concerning. Or if he's getting taken out of some situations within a drive, I would also find that concerning.
Right. Yeah, I think going back to, our discussion previously, there is just such valuable information on both sides of it, and actually understanding both when they're taken out and when they're actually playing is just so valuable from a preseason expectation. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to obviously follow, kind of like what you said, you've hit on it so much previously. You understand, where Mike Vrabel's been at from a usage standpoint in the preseason. And if you can continue to kind of extrapolate that out, you are going to have a really good understanding of where Okinawa is going to be involved in this offense right away. And I think you can very much then draft accordingly with some of those drafts you have closer. So I love that play. I'm also, interested to see how the wide receiver position breaks out as well now with DeAndre Hopkins. And I do think you can use, in a lot of ways, some of the similar insights for guys like Nick Westbrook and Treylon Burks as well, just to see if they are, involved or not, I would say at that point in time. So.
Fair enough. And that'll wrap it up for us. Thank you everyone for listening. If you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, definitely check that out. Please like, comment, and subscribe. That goes a huge way for us. Also, we have a PFF Fantasy Discord that we've been tweeting out. So you can find information about us there and join the community that we've been building there. And Ben, do you have any articles or anything that you would like to plug?
I got some win total articles coming up here once again and some betting related stuff. Then we're going to take a look at fantasy projections, and also I'm hoping to get an article out with my guy Judah Fortgang on just some development type stuff at the quarterback position and maybe some useful PFF type parting stats that can kind of help us guide us in understanding some of these, when a quarterback's maybe going to take a leap or not in their progression from year 2 to year 3 and onwards, and what sort of traits we need to look at in order for that to kind of happen. So a lot of coming up here, but I would say it's officially football season. I can't wait for some of the, I can't wait for the first preseason recap article, because I feel like that's when it's finally going to feel real more than anything else. So it's here to stay.
Yeah, it's always the Hall of Fame game and see if any of the starters play. So I either have something to get excited for or nothing to get excited for, but then we'll have the first full week of the preseason from there. But this week I had my Superflex rankings go up today. I'll have an update to my 12-team draft strategy with up-to-date ADPs and slight changes in my rankings for all of those. So we can have up-to-date information there. More draft strategy on 10-team leagues. I'll start touching on league winners this week with running backs and tight ends. And then I'll continue with several more player profiles that I've been cranking out. So hopefully we'll have a ton of those players done by the time the season starts and everyone is drafting before that. So that'll all be coming out later this week. And then next week next episode later this week, we will have John back. So we'll continue having 2 podcasts a week. And then once we start hitting preseason, we'll probably increase that a little bit more. But until then, thank you and peace out.